Melissa held the warm cup of tea between her hands, sitting at the kitchen table as she watched Rachel across from her. The elderly woman stirred her tea absent-mindedly, her face etched with time and worry. "I hate having to ask you this, sweetheart," Rachel sighed, lowering her gaze. "But I don't have a choice. The contractor won't start the renovations without a down payment and, well, I just don't have that kind of money right now." Melissa set her cup down and reached across the table, covering Rachel's hand with a firm, reassuring squeeze. "Rachel, you don't have to explain yourself. I have the money saved up, and I can help you." For a brief moment, her mother-in-law's weary eyes lit up. "I'll pay you back, I swear." "I know you will," Melissa smiled. "And even if you couldn't, it wouldn't change a thing. You deserve to have this house just the way you've always dreamed of." Rachel blinked a few times, as if holding back tears. So few people in the world seemed to genuinely care about her, and Melissa was one of them. The check was handed over that same afternoon, and from that moment on, something shifted between them. What had once been a polite but distant mother and daughter-in-law relationship turned into a genuine friendship. Rachel started inviting Melissa over for tea every afternoon, sharing stories from the past, reminiscing about memories no one else seemed to cherish. But while their bond grew stronger, Stephen and Paul seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. "Mom's getting more and more attached to Melissa," Paul muttered, sprawled out on Stephen's leather couch. "Have you noticed?" "Of course I have." Stephen rolled his eyes. "But so what? She's old. She needs company." Paul scoffed, crossing his arms. "Don't be naive. Melissa's taking advantage of her loneliness. I bet she's already sinking her claws into the house." Stephen let out a sarcastic laugh. "You really think Melissa wants that rundown house? She's just being nice. Unlike us, who barely even show up over there." "Nice?" Paul scoffed. "Nobody does anything for free, Stephen. You better wake up." Stephen brushed it off. He didn't want to listen to his brother. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. 6 months passed. The renovations started. The house got a new lease on life, and Rachel seemed happier than ever. But then on a chilly September morning, the news hit like a thunderclap. Rachel had passed away in her sleep. The funeral was held at the local funeral home. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, and the hushed murmur of conversations created a muffled hum in the room. Dressed in black, Melissa clutched a tissue in her hands, her eyes red from crying. But through the tears and the weight of loss, something started to nag at her. Stephen and Paul were there, sure, but their faces didn't carry grief. If anything, they looked impatient. "When is this going to be over?" Paul whispered to Stephen, shifting restlessly. Melissa frowned, watching them from a distance. They weren't mourning, they weren't sad. It was almost like they were counting down the minutes for this to end. Stephen adjusted his watch and lowered his voice. "The lawyer said the will reading is tomorrow morning." Paul let out a relieved sigh. "Finally, let's see what's coming our way." A chill ran down Melissa's spine. What were they so eager for? And why did they seem more concerned about the inheritance than about losing their own mother? She didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out. And nothing could have prepared her for what was coming. The lawyer's office was heavy with tense silence. The dim yellow light from the desk lamp cast sharp shadows over the mahogany table where an old leather folder sat. Rachel's will was inside, and Melissa could feel the invisible weight of what was about to happen. Stephen and Paul sat beside her, but there was something off about them. They didn't look like grieving sons. They looked like men waiting for a payday. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began. "Before we go over the distribution of assets, I'd like to point out that this will was updated just over 5 months ago, properly signed and notarized." Stephen and Paul exchanged a quick glance. Melissa noticed. Something in that look told her they were expecting anything except surprises. The lawyer turned the first page and continued. "Rachel left behind some bank investments, a few pieces of jewelry, and savings divided equally between her children. The luxury home of her late husband, along with the attached assets, will be split between Stephen and Paul." Stephen let out a quiet sigh of relief while Paul gave a half smile, but the lawyer wasn't done yet. "As for the residence where Mrs. Rachel lived in her final years," he paused briefly, reading again to double-check. Then he looked up at Melissa. "This house was left exclusively to Melissa Thompson." The silence that followed was deafening. Paul was the first to react. "What?" His voice cracked, as if he'd swallowed something bitter. Stephen slowly turned his face toward the lawyer, like he couldn't have heard that right. This must be a mistake," he murmured, his voice heavy with disbelief. Melissa blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. The house is mine," The lawyer nodded. Yes. In her will, Rachel wrote that this was her way of showing gratitude for everything you did for her in the last few months. She made it clear that no one cared for her the way you did. Paul exploded in fury. This is ridiculous. My mother would never do this. That woman, he pointed an accusing finger at Melissa. That woman must have manipulated my mother. Melissa felt the blood run cold in her veins. What? You think I... Stephen stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't accept this. His voice was low but laced with restrained anger. He turned to the lawyer. There has to be a way to nullify this will. Melissa's eyes widened. Stephen. He didn't even look at her. The husband she knew, or thought she knew, was no longer there. Paul leaned over the table. This isn't over. My mom was sick, old, vulnerable. We're taking this to court. Melissa felt her chest tighten. It wasn't about the house. It never was. It was about greed, wounded egos, and the inability to accept that Rachel made a choice for herself. She looked at Stephen, searching for some trace of the man she once loved. You can't be serious. Finally, he met her eyes. But the look she found wasn't one of love or understanding. It was pure coldness. If you had an ounce of decency, you'd give up this house right now. That was the moment Melissa realized. The man who shared her bed, her life, her heart, was a complete stranger. The door slammed shut behind Melissa, echoing through the quiet house. Her hands trembled as she tried to take off her rain-soaked jacket. The air in the house felt different, heavy, like the walls were absorbing the anger and betrayal from the past week. Stephen was sitting on the couch, legs spread, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes locked on her with a cutting intensity. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Melissa. His voice was low, but dripping with venom. She let out a humorless laugh, tossing her purse onto the nearest chair. I'm making it harder, she pointed to herself in disbelief. You and your brother tried to slander me in front of a lawyer. Stephen slowly stood up, adjusting the collar of his shirt like he was trying to maintain some sort of composure. You need to understand, this house shouldn't be yours. Melissa crossed her arms, feeling a chill run down her spine. My mother-in-law left the house to me, her choice. You can't accept it because you can't admit that your mom chose to give me what was hers instead of giving it to you. Stephen slammed his hand on the back of the couch, making Melissa take an involuntary step back. You're playing with fire, Melissa. Don't you realize this could destroy everything? She stared at him for a long moment. Everything? Or what you thought you were going to inherit? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them spoke louder than any words could. Melissa swallowed hard, feeling the weight of that realization sink into her chest. The man she loved never really loved her. I'm not giving up the house, she said, firm. Stephen took a step forward, his eyes dark and as hard as stone. If you do this, Melissa, there's no turning back. She felt a lump in her throat but held her gaze steady. Maybe there isn't. That very night, Melissa packed bags and boxes with everything that was hers. Stephen didn't help. He didn't try to stop her. He just stood there in the hallway, arms crossed, watching her pack up the pieces of a life he'd already thrown away. When she left, the rain started again. But this time, she didn't feel cold. She felt relief. Rachel's house was quiet when Melissa opened the front door. The scent of her mother-in-law's perfume still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint smell of old wood. She ran her hands over the furniture, feeling a mix of melancholy and peace. This house was hers now, not for money, not for greed, but because Rachel wanted it to be. As she explored the rooms, she noticed there were still some boxes left unopened in the master bedroom. Curiously, she started to open them. Old photographs, yellowed notebooks, carefully folded dresses. Then, at the back of the closet, under some clothes, she found something different. A small wooden chest, locked with a rusty gold clasp. Her heart started racing. She pulled open the lid, which creaked as it opened. Inside, there was only one thing, a folded letter with her name handwritten on it. Melissa's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope and opened it. Rachel knew that money would come back, but not in the way Melissa thought. Melissa's hands shook as she slid her fingers over the aged paper. Rachel's handwriting, firm and delicate, filled the page with words that somehow seemed to speak directly to her heart. The faint scent of faded ink mixed with the smell of old wood from the room. She took a deep breath before starting to read. My dear Melissa, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer here. But before anything else, I need you to know something. You are not alone. I know Stephen and Paul will do everything they can to challenge my decision, But this house is yours and no one can take that away from you. I know everything must seem confusing right now, but there's something you need to understand about the $10,000 you lent me." Melissa furrowed her brow, squeezing the letter tighter. What did Rachel mean by this? When I asked for that money, it wasn't just to renovate the house. I could have sold some jewelry. I could have waited a little longer, but I needed to act fast because I discovered something Stephen and Paul never wanted to come to light. That money, Melissa, it wasn't used for the renovation. I used it to hire a private investigator because there was something wrong with the family's finances. Melissa's heart raced. I found out that my own children were stealing from me. Stephen and Paul, the same ones now trying to take this house from you, had been siphoning money from my accounts for years. They did it in small amounts, subtly, so I wouldn't notice. But when I started questioning things, when I asked about discrepancies in the numbers, Stephen tried to convince me I was just confused. So I hired someone, and what he found was far worse than I ever imagined. Melissa brought her hand to her mouth. Stephen and Paul opened a joint account in my name without me knowing. They were transferring small amounts into it, calling it house maintenance, taxes. But the truth, they were saving that money for when I died. They were already counting on my absence. I never confronted them directly. I never wanted to accept that my own children were waiting for me to die to get their hands on what wasn't theirs. But when I realized time was running out, I made my decision. I had to repay your kindness, Melissa. You were the only one who treated me like a real mother. You were the only one who saw me beyond the money, beyond my old age. And that's why this house is yours. Melissa felt her eyes fill with tears. Rachel knew, she always knew. The $10,000 you lent me have come back to you in a way I'm sure you never imagined. But more than anything, I wanted to give you something that can't be bought. A home where you will truly be happy. Don't let them make you doubt that. With love, Rachel. Melissa slowly lowered the letter, as if she needed a moment to process everything. Stephen and Paul had stolen from their own mother, manipulated, lied, schemed behind her back, and now they were trying to do the same to her. Anger surged up her throat like an overwhelming wave. Before she could process anything else, there was a loud knock on the front door. She stood up slowly, the paper still clenched in her sweaty hand. She walked toward the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The knocks grew more and more impatient. She didn't need to open the door to know who it was. Stephen and Paul had arrived, and they weren't about to accept defeat so easily. The knocking on the door grew more intense. Thud, thud, thud. Like Stephen and Paul believed they could knock it down with the force of their own anger. Melissa stood still in the hallway for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, a new feeling took over her. Not fear. It was certainty. The certainty that those two men couldn't control her anymore. She opened the door. Stephen walked in first, brushing past her without an invitation, his eyes flashing. Paul followed right behind, his face twisted with frustration. "The fun's over, Melissa," Stephen said, his voice low and sharp. "We talked to our lawyers. This will is not going to stand." Paul crossed his arms, scoffing. "You may have fooled our mum, but you're not going to fool the law." Melissa gripped Rachel's letter tightly in her hands. "Fool your mother?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. "You guys really have no shame, do you?" Stephen took a step forward. "You have no right to this house." Melissa slowly raised the letter. "What if I told you I have proof that you two were stealing from Rachel while she was still alive?" Paul froze. Stephen frowned for a second, but quickly regained his composure. "You're out of your mind." Melissa opened the drawer of the dresser beside her and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Rachel hired a private investigator. She knew everything. About the account you opened in her name, the transfers, the small withdrawals. It's all here." Paul swallowed hard. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Melissa tossed the envelope onto the table. "Then why are you sweating?" Stephen tried to hide his nervousness, but his hands were trembling. "This doesn't prove anything." Melissa crossed her arms. "Maybe not, but one thing is for sure." She walked over to the desk and grabbed a document. "Rachel's will. You guys were so focused on taking this house from me that you didn't notice an important clause." She unfolded the paper and pointed to an underlined paragraph. "If any of the parties involved try to contest the will in court," she paused, looking directly at Stephen and Paul, "this portion of the estate will be donated to charity." Stephen's face turned red. Paul's eyes widened. "What?" Melissa took a deep breath. "That's right. The house wasn't going to go to you, but if you tried to take it from me, you'd lose the part you already had." Paul took a step forward, outraged. "This is ridiculous." Melissa raised her eyebrows. "Really? Then why is Rachel's signature on this document?" Stephen grabbed the will off the table, his eyes scanning the words desperately. He then threw it back down, turning to Paul. "This can't be real. There has to be a way to reverse it." Melissa smiled. "Oh, I checked with the lawyer. It's real. And now that you've contested it, guess what? You've got nothing left." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Paul ran his hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. Stephen clenched his fists, grinding his teeth. "This is your fault," Paul yelled, pointing at Stephen. "My fault? You're the one who wanted to take it to court first." Melissa watched as the two brothers, once united by greed, now tore each other apart. Stephen pointed a finger at her, his eyes full of hatred. "You're going to pay for this." Melissa took a step forward, her face now calm. "I already have, for years. But now I'm free." The brothers stared at each other for a few more seconds before slamming the door behind them. Melissa let out a long sigh, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She grabbed Rachel's letter and held it close to her chest. The house was hers. But more than that, her life was hers again. Sometimes true wealth isn't in what you can own, but in what you choose to preserve. Dignity, self-respect, and the courage to say, enough. There are moments when life forces us to see who's really by our side and who's just taking advantage of our kindness. And as painful as it is, those revelations set us free. Because when greed strips away the masks, the truth becomes our greatest defense. In the end, it's not about winning a battle, it's about not losing yourself in the middle of it. If this story kept you hooked until the end, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments, what city are you watching us from? I'd love to hear.